I am currently walking on the grounds that are home to the site of Florida's largest and bloodiest battle of the American Civil War. Now, this is a battlefield that I visited early on in the Project Past journey. However, I feel like I didn't really do a great job telling the story of the Olustee battlefield here. So I'm back because you wanted more Civil War content. So let's see what we can learn about the battle in the Pines. Now, before we learn about the battle that was fought just back here, let's learn how and why these two armies even wound up in this dense Florida forest here. Now, in early February of 1864, the Union's Department of the South ordered an expedition into Florida. Now, commanding was Brigadier General Truman Seymour, and he would land his troops in Jacksonville in early February, I believe February 7th. Now, there were a few goals to this expedition. The first was to sever Confederate supply lines. Now, believe it or not, Florida was a massive producer of beef and salt for the Confederacy here, especially after the fall of Vicksburg. The Confederate armies deployed in the western and eastern theaters relied heavily on beef and salt from Florida. So that was a goal for the Union. They obviously wanted to stop this. A second goal was to free slaves and recruit them into the Union Army. And another goal that they had, which I thought was interesting, was they wanted to bring Florida back into the Union, at least a large portion of it. And hopefully they can do this before the election in 1864. So those were just some of the goals of the expedition into Florida in 1864. Now, for the Confederates, General P.G.T. Beauregard would correctly guess Seymour's objective was Florida, and he would dispatch reinforcements. And those reinforcements would be under the command of the Georgian Alfred H. Colquitt, and he would bolster Florida's defenses in an attempt to stop Seymour. Now, Colquitt would arrive just in time to reinforce the Florida troops who were stationed here under the command of Brigadier General Joseph Finnegan. So we're about, I would say, 10 to 12 miles from Lake City, which is in this direction, which is west, and about 2 miles in this direction is the small town of Olustee. Now, within that small town of Olustee, you have this rail line, and at the time in 1864, there was a vital railway junction there. And in fact, this rail line that you're seeing before us here was actually a rail line that ran through this area. So obviously the tracks have been replaced, but this isn't the general location of that rail line at the time of the battle. So the Union obviously wanted to capture this. Well, the Confederate plan was to build defenses just outside of the town of Olustee, and on the Confederate left flank you would have the large pond called Ocean Pond. That was anchoring the left flank, and on the Confederate right flank you had swamplands, and just before the Confederate defenses you had a narrow corridor, which was the perfect defensive position. You can funnel in Union troops. Well, the Confederates wanted to draw the Union forces to this, obviously, so they would dispatch units to man this area. And their job was to try and draw the Union into the Confederate corridor there and their breastworks. Well, unfortunately for the Confederate plan, the fighting just before us here intensified so quick that both sides began dispatching more and more troops, and the Battle of Olustee was underway in the fields before us here. So right around 2:30 in the afternoon, Union troops began emerging from this direction, skirmishing with the Confederate skirmishers, and that skirmish would intensify, and thus the Battle of Olustee was born. And the majority of the fighting would take place here. Now, we are looking where the Confederates would have been coming from. Right here to my left you would have had the 19th Georgia. To their right you would have had the 28th Georgia, then the 64th Georgia, then the 23rd, the 1st, and the 32nd Georgia, anchored all the way in this direction by the 6th Georgia. And in this general direction, you would have had the 7th Connecticut, the 7th New Hampshire, along with the 8th United States Colored Troops. So they were coming into line of battle here, and like we just touched on, your Confederate forces were coming from this direction here. So we're going to be essentially marching right in the middle of both of these armies here. So let's see what we can learn. So when the Union forces left Jacksonville a few days prior to the Battle of Olustee, they encountered several small bands of Florida militia. Now, when the fighting began erupting on the field behind you on the camera here, Brigadier General Seymour thought he was up against more militia, so he was committing his initial brigades very piecemeal, which would turn out to be detrimental to the Union cause here. All right, so we did move, so I do want to reorient you. So that's where we just were. The front of the park is there. That's where the railroad line runs. And this general location is where that skirmishing that we were just talking about began. As you can see by the depiction here, you have Confederate skirmishers making contact with Union cavalry. And as the fighting intensified and the armies drew closer to one another, they were drawn in to the terrain you see before us here. Now, something I want to point out is I've lived in Florida my entire life, so I'm used to it. But if you're an advancing army in your linear formations, remember that's the military doctrine of that time, this terrain is not conducive for unit cohesion. So your ranks are going to be broken up, communication is going to be a lot more difficult, and on top of it, if you're inexperienced, you have no idea what you're about to walk into. This terrain's kind of swampy. I don't know how wet it was in February of 1864, but February can be a wet month. But you can see these palmetto thickets. If you're not watching where you're stepping, you're going to end up right on your face. And obviously you have the pines here, which provide some cover, but like we just touched on, they also can break up your formations too. So imagine you're a New York soldier or a soldier from somewhere in the Northeast, and now you're here in the thick, hot, humid forests of Florida. Now, the first Union brigade to take the field here was Howley's brigade, and within Howley's brigade you had the 7th New Hampshire, the 7th Connecticut, and the newly formed 8th United States Colored Troops. They were green. They were literally mustered a couple months prior to the Battle of Olustee here, so you can just imagine what's going through their minds. You know, they've never seen combat, they've had minimal training, and now they're advancing through this, and things aren't going well from the Union right off the bat here. Now, we had Howley's brigade taking the field. In this general area here, you would have the 7th Connecticut closest to us. I believe the 7th New Hampshire in the middle, and kind of by the visitor center there, in the beginning of the video, you would have had the 8th United States Colored Troops. Well, upon arriving, the 7th New Hampshire was given conflicting orders. So you had half of the regiment advancing, you had half of the regiment reforming, you had a part of the regiment doing absolutely nothing, and it was described as a disorganized mob. So you can imagine, as you're receiving your initial volleys from the Confederate forces here, and now your comrades down, you're giving conflicting orders and chaos is ensuing. Well, the 7th New Hampshire broke and exposed the flank of the 8th United States Colored Troops, who we just touched on were extremely green. So I want to put ourselves in the shoes of the 8th United States Colored Troops. Like we just touched on, this was a very inexperienced regiment, and now a regiment that has been in combat before to our right just broke, leaving us all alone essentially. We've been up since 6 a.m. We've been marching to this location in terrain that's not really familiar to us. It's hot, it's humid, we're scared, we're inexperienced, we don't have much training, but we have our officers. So, you know, these men probably would have looked to their officers to not only steady themselves, but to keep advancing, and kind of, they were a sense of reassurance, you can say. Well, their commander, Colonel Charles Fribley, would have been killed in the opening moments of this battle. So you can imagine, you know, the officer that you're looking to steady yourself is now killed in the initial volley. Maybe one of your comrades next to you just got killed as well. You know, you have every reason to break and run. But the 8th didn't. They stood their ground, and they began delivering volleys against the Confederate forces there, buying the Union time to bring up more men. Well, the 8th suffered for this. Although they held their ground and they fought valiantly, they suffered over 300 casualties just in the few minutes that they were engaged here at Olustee. So one thing to remember is this battle was bloody for both sides involved here. And even though the 7th New Hampshire and the 8th United States Colored Troops were suffering greatly, the 7th Connecticut was sporting Spencer repeating rifles. And upon taking the field here, they unleashed a volley, catching the 64 Georgia off guard. And there's an account that all the regimental field officers in the 64th Georgia went down in that initial volley. And the 7th Connecticut would advance and push the 64th Georgia back. But unbeknownst to them, they had no flank support, so they were kind of caught in a crossfire, so they would have had to pull back here. Now, Hawley's brigade has essentially been driven from the field, leaving the Confederates in control of the field you see before us here. Now, upon seeing this, Brigadier General Seymour would reluctantly tell Colonel William Barden's brigade to advance, and within that brigade you had the 47th, the 48th, and the 115th New York. So they would take the field and essentially stop the Confederate advance here, at least momentarily. So we've been making our way down this trail. We're facing east now, and to our left, this is where you would have your Union regiments. In this direction here, you would have the regiments we were just talking about, the 7th New Hampshire, 7th Connecticut, 8th United States Colored Troops, and in this direction here, you would have had the New York troops taking the field here, the 115th New York, the 47th, and the 48th New York. Now, they would have been kind of along this line here. And we're going to head on over to the Confederate side now, which is in this direction here. So now we are facing where the Confederate regiments would have been positioned. And this field in between us was what was separating these two armies, who were pretty much evenly matched. I think the Union had 5,500 troops. The Confederates had just around 5,000. So they were duking it out in the woods here. Now, although it seemed like a lopsided victory in the beginning of the battle, things have kind of stabilized a bit, and now it just turned into a slugfest. You have the New York regiments that are on the field now, duking it out with the Georgia regiments in this direction here, which is where we're headed. So that rail line that we saw in the beginning of the video, it runs in this direction here. You can't see it from here, but I would say it's about maybe 100 to 150 yards in this direction, which I believe we're facing south. Now, at some point in the battle, the Confederates brought up a rail car that had a massive gun on one of its cars here, and it began delivering fire into the Union lines here. Now, this sign is saying it was a large cannon that was mounted on a railroad flat car, which shot a large shell every 5 minutes. I'm not sure what type of gun that is, or if that rate of fire is abnormally slow. I just don't know. But what I do know is you had a very large gun on a rail car in this direction, and it was just tearing gaps into the Union lines here. Now, at this point in the battle, man, the battle has been raging for about 3 hours. You have the New York regiments on the field. They're getting hit with huge shells tearing gaps in their lines. You had a number of Union artillery pieces captured that were placed here during the beginning of the battle. So again, you can kind of see the writing on the walls for the Union troops here. But let's head on over to the Confederate lines here, which are just in front of us. So we have made our way to the Confederate lines now. I don't know if you can see it, but right there is where the interpretive sign for that railway cannon piece is. And on that side, that interpretive sign right there, that is a trail where we were analyzing the Union positions here. So we are on the Confederate left flank. Now, this position was held by the 6th Georgia, and the 6th Georgia held this position so long that they ran out of ammunition. Again, it's around 5 o'clock. The battle's been raging for 3 hours, and they are beginning to push back the New York regiments that were advancing in this direction. But there was just one small issue. The 6th Georgia and a few other Georgia regiments were essentially running out of ammunition. And I have an account for you that I want to share with you by an officer who was in the 6th Georgia. He would state, at one time, for at least half an hour, the regiment was without ammunition, except as it was obtained from the cartridge boxes of the killed and wounded. Under a heavy fire, the regiment stood its ground, not giving an inch. When almost the last round of ammunition was expended and the bravest began to despair, a supply of ammunition was received. So, this regiment held its ground for a half hour with no ammunition besides what they can scrounge off of the dead and dying soldiers here. Finally, Confederate reinforcements would arrive and deliver ammunition and much needed reinforcements, and the Union began to pull back entirely here because Brigadier General Seymour was realizing that the day was lost. So we've made our way back over to the visitor center where we started, and at this point in the battle, the Union forces are in full retreat. The Confederates are going to be pursuing them in this direction here. Now we are facing east, and that is where Jacksonville is. Well, Brigadier General Truman Seymour would dispatch Colonel James Montgomery's brigade to come up and act as a rear guard. And within Montgomery's brigade, you had the 1st North Carolina Volunteer Infantry, who were predominantly made up of former slaves from the Carolinas and I believe a little bit in Virginia. So they obviously had a pretty vested interest in this battle. And I don't know if they had any combat experience, but accompanying the 1st North Carolina Volunteer Infantry, you had the famed 54th Massachusetts Volunteer Infantry. And if you're thinking about the movie Glory, yes, that is the unit portrayed in that movie. They fought here at Olustee, and they came right through this area, acting as the rear guard that allowed what was left of the Union Army to retreat back to Jacksonville. Now, they would come up through this area. Now, I say general area because there was no regimental markers, there was no flank markers marking these units' locations. I'm just going by off what maps that are available. And one of the maps that I saw has the 54th Massachusetts just to the left of the railway tracks, and those railway tracks are just on the other side of that wall. So they came through this area, and there were reports of the 54th shouting 3 cheers for Massachusetts and $7 a month. Now what they're referring to is they were getting paid $7 a month, and I believe white soldiers at this time were either getting 10 or 13. I don't remember the exact number. So African American soldiers were not getting equal pay to their white counterparts. So they'd come through this area singing the Star Spangled Banner and then shouting 3 cheers for Massachusetts and $7 a month. Now, it is because of the 54th Massachusetts and the 1st North Carolina that they were able to blunt the Confederate advance and allowed a bulk of the Union Army to retreat back to Jacksonville, like we touched on. Now, in doing so, the 54th Massachusetts would suffer 86 casualties in this area. And I believe the 1st North Carolina suffered far greatly. I want to say 200. I could be a little off on that, but they suffered pretty heavily here too. Now, the 54th Massachusetts Bravery wasn't done. Now, following the battle here, a train carrying wounded soldiers would break down, I believe near an area called 10 Mile Station. And the 54th Massachusetts arrived, attached ropes to the engine and the cars, and manually pulled the train almost 3 miles to Camp Finnegan. Now, from Camp Finnegan, they attached horses to the train, and the men of the 54th and what horses they can scrounge pulled this train a total distance of 10 miles, and it took almost 42 hours. That is unbelievable, and that just shows the sheer bravery and determination of the 54th Massachusetts here. So by now, we obviously know that this was a Union defeat, and since the Union was defeated, they left behind their dead, their wounded, and the Confederates would capture a large number of Union troops here. Well, making up those casualties were a pretty large number of United States colored troops. They were heavily engaged here, as we just learned. Well, there are numerous reports, most from the Confederate side, of quote-unquote roaming bands of Confederate soldiers executing wounded African-American soldiers and captured African-American soldiers. Now, I don't know on how large of a scale that this took place, but there are numerous accounts of this taking place on the fields before you here. Now, many of the Union dead following the battle here were buried by Confederate troops in shallow mass graves, and several years after the battle, I believe in 1866, a U.S. Army detail would arrive here in Olustee, and they were tasked with finding the remains of U.S. soldiers, and almost 125 U.S. soldiers' remains were brought to this location and reburied, and a makeshift memorial was placed. And the original memorial was wood, and it didn't even last until the 1870s. And for the longest time, this area just laid unmarked. You had the remains of 125 United States soldiers who were killed in combat, just laying unidentified. Well, this changed. In 1991, a reenacting group came here and erected this permanent memorial made of concrete to honor those men who were killed here. Now, I believe the Confederate dead of this battle, they were brought to another cemetery, I believe near Lake City, but the Union were buried here. And there's no documentation of the remains ever being removed, so I think it's safe to assume that 125 Union soldiers, United States soldiers, rest just before us here. And we'll have a closer look here to the memory of the officers and soldiers of the United States Army who fell in the Battle of Olustee, February 20th of 1864. And just below that This memorial replaces the original wooden one erected on this site in May of 1866. I think that's an awesome gesture of the reenacting group here that came and recognized that these soldiers were not being honored in a way that they should. Now, Olustee Battlefield is a state park, and I don't know the logistics of a state park as opposed to a national park. I just find it weird that a reenacting group had to come here and erect a permanent memorial for the soldiers that fought and died here, as opposed to the government providing one or, you know, the state providing one. Again, I don't know all the logistics. Maybe they did, maybe they tried, so I don't want to, you know, point fingers, but I don't know. It's just a little weird to me that a reenacting group had to come here and erect a memorial for U.S. soldiers that died in combat. So that was the Battle of Olustee, take 2. You know, there isn't a whole lot out there about this battle, but the more I dig into it, the more interesting it becomes, at least to me. Now I want to leave you with something, and you got to listen carefully because it is a bit of a play on numbers. I recognize that only 11,000 men fought here at Olustee, which by Civil War standards is a pretty small battle. But when you look at the number of men engaged for the Union and the number of casualties they suffered, and remember they almost suffered 2,000 casualties, this ranks as one of the bloodiest battles of the entire war when you look at the percentages that the Union suffered here. And that is remarkable to me because that's something you just don't really know about until you come here. I hope you enjoyed this one, and catch you on the next one.